Today we're reviewing the AMD Ryzen 7 5700G. This is the $360 counterpart to the R5 5600G that we reviewed recently. That one, $260. Both of these CPUs are what AMD calls APUs. They have integrated graphics processors. We call those IGPs here. Some people call them iGPUs. And of course, they have a CPU component as well. This is something that's been around a long time, but it's particularly interesting right now because one, we got them 2 months ahead of the official DIY launch, and two, GPU market. That's kind of enough said there. Let's get into the review. Before that, this video is brought to you by Corsair and their 5000D Airflow. The Corsair 5000D Airflow is an ATX tower with high material build quality and a focus on cooling performance, with attention paid to small details. The case has a unique look with deeply indented cooling pathways on the sides of the front and top panels and has carefully matched colors across the case, available in both white and black. Learn more at the link in the description below. So just to quickly recap the basics from the 5600G review if you missed it. You should probably watch a couple minutes of that if you did miss it. So APUs, they've been around a long time, but ultimately there's a couple key points to be interested in. One, how do they compare versus a cheap CPU and a cheap dGPU? Typically, this would be something like looking at a $130, $140 APU versus, let's say, a $60 CPU and maybe somewhere in the range of $80 to $90 for a dGPU. So then you end up with a slightly more expensive option versus a slightly less expensive option, but ultimately in the same ballpark, and comparing discrete versus combined, all-inclusive with the APUs. That's the typical approach to this. Now we have the bonus this time of one, having more expensive parts at $260 and $360, the APUs, and two, having a GPU market that actually makes these still appealing. But they're also more powerful than previously. They're still on Vega architecture for the AMD 5000 series APUs, so we've not moved to RDNA 1 or 2, it is Vega, and they're also on Zen 3 architecture, and they're on 7 nanometer. AMD's mostly unified the naming at this point. It's not as chaotic as it used to be, and so everything's moved towards more modern parts, except for the graphics component, which is Vega. Some basic specs here. These support officially 3200 megahertz, but you can overclock further if you'd like for the memory. They are on the 5700G, 8 cores, 16 threads. 5600G reviewed as appropriate to the 600 naming as 6 and 12. The 5700G has a 3.8 gigahertz base and 4.6 advertised boost. We'll be validating that. It has 8 CUs of Vega architecture GPU rather than 7 on the 5600G. A CU, as a reminder, is a compute unit, and within that is contained the streaming processors, for example. There's 16 megabytes of L3 on the 5700G. It's 45 to 65 watts for TDP. It blows past this, but the TDP number is somewhat meaningless. As you can see in the formula for AMD TDP, power isn't even in the equation, so this is more of an approximation of the cooling requirements. And also, the APUs officially launched March 13th. So they've been out for a while, but you can only really get them through OEMs right now or eBay. And please don't pay scalped prices for these. It's a terrible idea, really bad value. And again, as a reminder, CPUs are much more available than the GPUs. So there's a lot less buying pressure to pay the scalped prices. And these are going to come out on August 5th for the DIY market. Hopefully there's a good volume of them, but CPUs have been in better shape than GPUs. So it's OEM right now. That means it's a launched retail product. It is ready for testing. The drivers are real. It's not like pre-production. Nothing's pre-production because it is in production. It's selling in retail channels. But there might be changes to the silicon. There might be stepping changes, driver changes, whatever, for DIY launch. So we'll revisit these once it comes time. As for differences between these and the Ryzen 5000 Zen CPUs, this is important for you to know as well. These are, again, a monolithic die as opposed to a chiplet approach on the Zen 3 Ryzen 5000 series CPUs without the IGP. That means that you are trading off a few things, a lot of things, complete change. But one of those things is trading off some of the cache to allocate die space, for example, for the IGP. You only have so much of a die you can use for each component of the CPU. Ultimately, look at a block diagram at a zoomed out scale and imagine some of those things going away to accommodate, obviously, the graphics processor. So that means this is at less cache than a 5600X or a 5800X. That contributes to lower performance in some of the testing, and it's why a 5700G or 5600G won't be at parity with, say, a 58 or a 5600X. The I/O is different as well. Actually, back to the cache, we're looking at something like 32 megabytes on a 5600X versus, for L3 cache that is, versus a 5700G. But on the I/O side, 24 lanes of PCIe Gen 3 on the Ryzen 5000 APUs. as opposed to Gen 4 on the desktop CPUs. Not a huge difference, not particularly relevant for current GPUs. A little bit of performance there, but not much, especially not when you're limited anyway. And then also there's lower frequency compared to desktop, and that will contribute to differences as well. So a quick talk about the testing we're doing today before we get into it. So IGP testing, we're doing three main types of tests. There's the IGP test, that's integrated graphics in games that are appropriate for them with settings that are appropriate for them so that they're comparable. You can see if you're not using a GPU or if you're doing a cheap CPU and dGPU, does it still make sense to buy an APU? That's one test we're doing. We're also doing CPU-only testing. This is where the IGP goes unused, and we're doing it through our CPU benchmarking and reviews suite. So that would be coupled with a 3080. It's our standard test suite. Everything's controlled. It's only a CPU comparison. This is helpful for, one, the performance of the CPU, even if you're using the IGP, because Blender or something, if you only render it through cycles on the CPU, that number will still be the same regardless of the presence of the GPU. And then two, it's useful if you plan on upgrading later, dropping a GPU into the slot, then you know where your limiting factors are on the CPU. The third one is GPU focused testing. So we added this by request of some of you all in the 5600G review. For this, it's a little bit ridiculous. Don't get mad at us, we did it by request, but basically we took the APU and we tested it in our GPU suite, which is targeted at higher end dGPUs. It's a different class, it's not really meant to perform there. But the point, or the request by the audience, was to get a comparison to lower end dGPUs, lower end in scare quotes there, like a 1660. We would consider that sort of mid-range, but it's semantic. So anyway, that's in here as well. And of course, if there's a GPU missing, you can always do some basic math. If you'd like to compare it anyway, you can take the known delta between part A and part B that are on the charts, and then extrapolate for part C compared to one of those two. And finally, we don't have a combination of a CPU and dGPU for $360 here to compare to the 5700G. We looked around, doesn't really seem like something you can create right now. If you're in a region where you can get a GPU or you spot one for roughly MSRP, then 1650 would have you under 200 bucks, and like 160, 150, and a 1660 MSRP would be in the 200s, like low 200s. So one of those, the 1660 and something like an i3 10100 or whatever, that would make sense maybe for a pairing, but we didn't bother with this because it mostly doesn't exist, but you can still get some of those numbers in one of the sets of charts. Let's get started. As usually, we'll start testing with frequency validation. This will help make sure our CPU is running as expected, but it also helps set your own expectations. If you buy any of these CPUs, you can run an all-core workload and average the core frequency to see if it's roughly in line with ours. The R5 5600G ran at about 4300 MHz all-core in our previous test, with the 5600X as an obvious Zen 3 comparison at about 4430 to 4440 MHz. The Ryzen 7 5700G is the new one in testing. The CPU averaged about 4372 to 4400 MHz depending, and we also noticed that the board would flip between 100.00 and 99.9 MHz BCLK regularly. This results in slight drops here and there, but it's just 0.1 MHz. It's multiplied against the multiplier, of course, so that does add up, but it's not as crazy as other stuff we've seen. The average all-core was 4373 MHz, and the 5700G is running faster in all-core frequency and has more cores than the 5600G. But it's still outpaced in frequency by the 5600X. The core advantage, however, is what'll matter. Single core frequency is next. As a recap, we found that the 5600G ran at 4440 MHz in the Cinebench workload, with the 5600X at about 4650 MHz. The 5700G ran a little lower at 4621 for the max single core boost during this workload, and that's in line with the advertised boost of 4600 MHz. It also matches AMD's Zen 3 previous behaviors at launch, where AMD overall over-delivered with frequency versus the advertised boost, and that's a good thing. CSGO is up for IGP benchmarking, tested at 1080p medium settings and in a controlled but real match. The AMD R7 5700G ranks at the top of this chart of IGPs and low-end GPUs that we've thus far tested here. It outperforms the previous R5 5600G leading score of 119 FPS average by 6.5%. The extra cores and the extra CU on the GPU have a measurable impact here, although an extra $100 is a 38% increase in price for 6.5% more performance. We wouldn't call that necessarily worth it, considering a lot of buyers of this type of product are on a strict budget, but it's better value than a 3080 Ti, so there is that. It eliminates a lot of the purpose if you're buying this on budget and value as opposed to, say, an R5 5600G. That one just makes a lot more sense when the budget is tight. The upside, however, is that as an 8-core CPU, in the event you later couple it with a dGPU, you're in a better starting position than with a 5600G. That makes it more upgradable than the 5600G if you're buying a 5700G with the intent of using its IGP as a stopgap solution until you can get a dGPU later. Later here should probably be on a scale of months rather than weeks, otherwise you're wasting money. Performance outdoes the Intel i3-10100 and the GT 1030 combined, both of which were in stock for about $260 at the time of writing in total. That puts those in competition with the 5600G. Fortnite with low settings is up now. We'll also test performance mode. With low settings, the R7 5700G scales an additional 8.4% over the R5 5600G. That landed at 102 FPS average over the 94 previously. The lows are within usual run-to-run variance and testing, and so aren't meaningfully different between the two parts. As we talked about in the 5600G review, some of these nonsensical combinations, like the 10900K with the GT 1030, are present to help demonstrate where the bottlenecks lie. In this instance, it's the GT 1030 limiting Intel's high-end CPUs. The CPUs are capable of more, but the GPU stops that, and so AMD climbs ahead on the back of its combined CPU and IGB solution. Intel's UHD 750 and the 11600K landed down at 49 FPS average, just plainly embarrassing here. That's not limited by the CPU, clearly, because an i3-10100 plots 40 FPS ahead when combined with any kind of GPU. So this is an IGP limiting performance in the UHD 750 scenario. Dropping to performance mode in Fortnite, where most options are disabled or focused on lower settings, the R7 5700G hauls to nearly 170 FPS average. It's outperformed by the 10900K, the 11600K, and the GT 1030 options here. So the GT 1030 is capable of better performance in some scenarios than the IGP of the AMD APU, and in this instance, that scenario is a CPU limitation. That makes sense. We've dropped the settings, so now the GPU is under less strain, and it's the CPU in need of keeping up. Of course, the GT 1030 is still ultimately limiting these two CPUs more than they would be with a better card. The R5 5600G's 155 FPS average allows the 5700G a lead of about 9.3%. That's actually climbing. It's better than the previous two, and that's because the CPU, becoming a limiting factor, allows the R7 to ascend the ranks at a faster pace than the R5. The CPU benefit in the R7 is its primary upgrade over what the R5 offers, not that one CU difference, although it can be useful. Either way, these can't outmatch true high-end CPUs, to no one's surprise, and if we look back at the lower end, the GT 1030 with GDDR5 and the i3-10100 or the R5 5600G, it would be far better value here, but at least the R7 5700G's value isn't as bad, again, as some of the other products we've looked at lately. The biggest thing is that it gives you a platform for upgrades, but just don't get caught up in that if you're never going to upgrade it, or you're going to upgrade it very quickly, because then it's wasted money once again. In Rocket League, the R7 5700G put up the same performance as the R5 5600G with our settings. We reran this 3 times for a total of 20 passes and ultimately produced the same data. The two are bottlenecked here. It might be an indication of a memory limitation, as that's controlled between both, but we'd have to dig deeper. The R5 5600G and GT 1030 combination shows the IGP is the weakness here, not the CPU, and given that the IGP talks through system memory rather than an onboard solution, the memory theory looks plausible. A cheap i3-10100 and GT 1030 combination outdoes both APU solutions in this game. AMD doesn't always rank ahead of the cheap CPU and cheap dGPU solutions, as we see here. Just to reiterate the point from our 5600G review, here's the same chart from that one. The 5600G CPU was barely getting used in Rocket League, which means we're completely off balance on system load. Load is far heavier on the GPU than the CPU, leaving the CPU mostly useless. Yes, even for precious multitasking of Discord, browser tabs, YouTube, and RGB software. No, you do not need 90% of your CPU to do those things while you play a video game. It should be more balanced. We only just added Rainbow Six Siege to our APU and IGP benchmarks, although it's been in our benchmarks for dGPUs for a long time. Charts are barren right now for this one, but still useful. At 1080p with our very high settings used in CPU reviews, the R7 5700G ended up at 58 FPS average compared to the 5600G's 53 FPS average. This is far more playable at these settings than on the UHD 750 and 630, although not very high. You could get it to be higher frame rate by dropping the quality settings, of course, lower. The Iris Xe Intel Phantom Canyon NUC solution does better to keep up than the desktop UHD solutions. We're moving on to CPU-focused testing with the standardized RTX 3080 that we use in our standalone CPU reviews for non-IGPs. This is important for establishing the capabilities of the CPU on its own, ignoring the graphics component of the R7 5700G completely. This would help those of you who seek to do a drop-in video card at a later date, or who just want a CPU and can't get a normal one without the IGP included, or maybe you just want something for troubleshooting. You'll be able to see where the CPU aligns with non-APU solutions here. Tested in a Blender all-core tile-based rendering workload using cycles, the AMD R7 5700G stock CPU ends up at about 18.2 minutes time required to complete the render. That puts it adjacent to the 11900K, which is embarrassing for a number of reasons, not the least of which is Intel's previous gen same MSRP 10900K, outmatching the 11900K by 6%. That's not news though, we talked about that before. The 5700G is directly comparable to the 8-core 16-thread 11700K or 10700K, the latter of which is $40 cheaper than the 5700G, but it lacks the more powerful IGP. The 5700G outperforms the 10700K in this workload with a 5% reduction in time required, with the 5700G outperforming the 5600G at a 28% reduction in time required. For point of reference, the 5700G is beaten by all of the Zen 3 CPUs with 8 cores and above. The 5800X is one of those, and it benefits from a 10% reduction in time required over the 5700G, although the 5600X is outperformed by the 5700G by 19%. That difference, expectedly, is thanks to the cores. Adobe Premiere up now, our favorite application that definitely works well and doesn't crash. Adobe Premiere is scored in aggregate on scrubbing playback speed, the rendering times, the filter application, and effects. And the R7 5700G ended up at 775 points, which ranks it between the 11600K OC and the 11700K stock. The 5700G outranks the 5600G by about 12% here, or the 5600X by 5%. The 5800X outdoes the 5700G by 9%. Chromium Code Compile tells us how long the CPU takes to compile a program. This is entirely CPU bound, but it benefits from certain attributes of the CPU more than others. Cache, for example, can be more beneficial in certain types of code compile. We can't represent all types in one chart, but it gives us a baseline. The 5800X reasserts its 11% time reduction here, with the 10700K again roughly adjacent to the 5700G in CPU-only performance. We'll move on from the IGP and the CPU-only production benchmarks and into our 5600G plus 3080 benchmarks for gaming. The purpose of this is academic. It's the same as the production benchmarks, and that's to determine how useful the CPU of the 5700G is when the IGP is eliminated from the equation. Cyberpunk 2077 with the RTX 3080 is obviously a lot more playable than without it. The 5700G ended up at 148 FPS average here when tested under identical conditions to all of the other CPUs on our bench. That left the 5600X to lead at 154 FPS average, which validated on a retest. This is the benefit of its higher average core clock in this instance versus the 5700G. Red Dead Redemption 2 in our CPU test suite has the 5700G at 152 FPS average, meaning the value of the CPU alone is approaching parity with the i5 11400. And that allows the 5600X a lead of about 7%. The 5700G isn't a direct 5800X alternative. The pure CPUs without an IGP simply have advantages that can't be met by their similarly named APU counterparts. If you had a sufficient supply of potatoes, you could probably build a computer capable of running F1 2020. It doesn't take much. The 5700G ends up at 268 FPS average, which has it about equal with an i5 10600K, and not far behind the 9900K, relatively speaking. The 5600X and 5800X run away from it here, minimally at a 20% advantage over the 5700G when all of them are used just for their CPU. In GTA 5, again tested with our CPU test suite settings, not the GPU suite or the IGP suite, the 5700G with a 3080 lands at 118 FPS average with lows in pace behind. That has it a 3% tick ahead of the 5600G, or approaching the 11400 as an equal. The 5800X and 5600X lead by a significant 17% margin. Time to move on to the GPU test suite. If the earlier data wasn't enough, we'll now get into some tests with our GPU suite. This is for big GPU reviews, so what we care about here will be relative FPS or percent scaling rather than absolute FPS. The The settings are not tuned for these lower end parts, and we need to make sure the higher end ones don't bottleneck at some point. The IGP suite is what you want for more realistic use. These results don't mean the IGP can't play these games, but it's just not at these settings in a lot of instances. It is, however, valid for comparison, and a lot of you requested this in the previous one. In Cyberpunk 2077 at 1080p high, which is our GPU suite setting, the 5700G ran at about 14 FPS average, with an unplayable blurring and stuttering when panning the camera or attempting to do literally anything. This allows the GTX 960 4GB a lead of 41%, the GTX 1060 6GB a lead of 153%, and the RX 580 a lead of 168%. If you're asking, but what about the GTX 1660? The answer is no one cares, because these are clearly not comparable. If you really want to know, you could look at the 1660 Super results we have in here and then approximate from the known delta between the 1660 Super and the 1660, but we didn't rerun it for this because it really just doesn't matter. We also included the GTA results from the GPU suite, mostly because it's a little bit easier to run. The AMD 5700G ended up at 26 FPS average. This establishes the 960 4GB as doubling the frame rate, the 1060 as jaunting to 92 FPS average, or a 2.6x gain, and the 1660 Super at about 109 FPS average. That's about what we'd expect when tested in the realm of dGPU comparisons. We also have 1440p numbers, but that seems cruel and unusual, so we'll move on. The APU has had enough of the GPU battleground, but we'll end it on Rainbow Six Siege at 1080p. It's a little bit less embarrassing. The 5700G ran at about 60 FPS average. Not bad, actually, especially at these settings. You could definitely play this game with the APU, but the GTX 960 is permitted a lead of about 48%. Looking at the GTX 1060 here, we see a lead of about 100 FPS. Hopefully that helps show where it performs relative to the higher end parts, the parts that are in another class entirely, where you're spending the entire value of the APU on one component. It's obviously, again, the IGP results that you'll care about more for single use. Finally, quick power consumption numbers. In a Blender all-core only workload, no IGP active, the 5700G pulled about 95 watts, 5800X was at 127 watts, so some of the performance starts to come into perspective. The 5700G remains relatively efficient overall, although no one beats the 5600X at power efficiency in this chart. Cinebench multi-threaded is tested within the tau window for Intel, but otherwise the numbers are similar everywhere. The 5700G ends up at 91 watts, with the 5600G at 77. Cinebench power consumption has the R7 5700G at just 19 watts under a single core workload. That scales beyond the 5600G by 4 watts. Remember, of course, that this is before VRM efficiency losses, so there's some of that at play, but not to this extreme. The 5600X sits at 22.8 watts for one core of work here. Finally, for APU power consumption in a mixed gaming workload, which we've only just added for testing, we can see how the R5 5600G and R7 5700G behave when in work that isn't fully bound by a single component. Instead, it's a bit of everything doing work, but we're still only measuring the power in at the EPS 12-volt cables. The mixed workload power consumption goes to 48 watts with GTA 5 at 1080p, and that's the highest we measured. It falls to 38 watts with Rocket League at 1080. The scaling in this chart is almost identical between the games and the two different parts. The takeaway is that these parts can be cooled with relatively little in the CPU cooler department thanks to the low power, so something like an AMD stock cooler would do okay for these. So closing out then, the 5700G's value is not as good as the $260 5600G. You get a lot of the performance, as in the vast majority of it, like 90% or so, or more sometimes, with the 5600G of the 5700G in a lot of these applications that are gaming. Once you get into Blender or production applications, really anything that starts to leverage the CPU, get use of those extra 2 cores, then the 5700G has a lot more value than it would in gaming. And it especially has value if you think you might drop in a GPU at a later date. Shouldn't be too soon after buying it, because then you blow out the value of the APU purchase entirely, and you should have just gotten a CPU and a dGPU. But if at a later date, say 6 months, a year from now, you want to drop in a card, then having that higher end 5700G as a baseline does give you a little bit of additional balance to your overall build, especially for CPU-bound tasks. If you don't do a lot of CPU-bound tasks, 5600G makes perfect sense. In a lot of instances, it's similar to a 3600 in CPU-bound benchmarking that we did. So that should give you an idea. We don't think the 5700G is great value for where it is. It does perfectly fine though, and it's actually really impressive where both of these APUs are, 56 and 7, relative to the past. They can play games now. They do pretty well. So as long as you're realistic about the settings, they do well. And it's really tough for us to review something in a market where a lot of the review is just contingent on what comparative parts you can even get. It does take away a lot of the comparative that we would normally do. So anyway, our advice to you would be look at the numbers we've presented and find the appropriate comparison based on the inventory in your region and then figure it out from there. But these will launch August 5th. We will be revisiting them to some extent anyway. And otherwise, you can look for them in OEM builds if you'd like to try and pick one up. We saw some from HP and a couple others. But that's it for this one. Thanks for watching. As always, subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you'd like to pick up a PC shortage shirt like this one, where we have cotton and tri-blend available, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus. Thank you for watching. We'll see you all next time.